this very busy point in the semester and a very busy day and a beautiful day. And thank the Institute of World Languages for the inaugural speaker series this year and sponsoring this event. And especially want to thank Rick Kern for taking time out of his very, very busy schedule to come and speak to us here in Charlottesville. So Richard Kern is a professor of French at UC Berkeley and director of the Berkeley Language Center. And he teaches courses on French linguistics, applied linguistics, and foreign language pedagogy, and directs the very impressive Berkeley Language Center. His research interests include second language acquisition, psycholinguistics, reading, writing, and technology. And he's been involved with researching uses of technology in language teaching for over 20 years. And he's the associate editor of the journal Language Learning and Technology. He's published extensively on these areas of research and experience and is the author of Literacy and Language Teaching, published at Oxford University Press. And he recently co-edited a research collection on video conferencing, Décrire la conversation en ligne, le face-à-face distanciel, published by ENS Editions in France. And he's currently finishing a book titled Language Technology and Literacy for Cambridge University Press. And I know that he really is finishing it because he said he was proofreading on the plane coming here, so maybe we won't have to wait too long to see that volume. And his talk today is entitled Technology and Language Learning, Why the Medium Matters. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Karen, for that introduction and for picking me up at the airport yesterday and being a fabulous hostess. To Cristina de la Coleta for having invited me, and to Miao Feng Teng for being a wonderful interlocutor and helping prepare for this visit. It's great to be here. Thank you for your patience in dealing with the technological issues. Now we'll talk about technology in a slightly different phase. And I'd like to just share some ideas that come out of the book that I'm working on, which is going to be not talking about practical things about what we can, new ways we can think of using technology in the classroom in a very narrow sense, but in a very, very expansive sense, looking at technology in the broadest sense rather than just computer technology. And I'd like to start the story some 5,000 years ago by looking at one of the first textbooks. This is a cuneiform clay tablet, and this is a pedagogical text. It is a word list providing a number of lexical items for trees, wooden objects, geographical names, types of spades, all from Sumer around 3000 BC. And here, this was used for the scribes to teach the apprentices how to write. The idea being that they would then copy this material. And I wanted to come to this because it deals with the material conditions that I'm going to be talking about throughout. In very early use of clay, there were pictographs that were used, where little drawings of the things that were represented. And so a bird had curved shapes showing the contour of the body of the bird, but they found that with the way that the clay dried in the sun, these curved lines didn't hold up very well, and they changed styluses and moved to cuneiform, making these wedge-shaped impressions where you poke instead of draw in the clay. These held up very nicely and made for very quick writing. So right there you have an influence of the medium on the type of writing that was designed over time. The point I want to make is that this is the same thing that's happening now when you think about text messages, tweets, and so forth, 140 character limits. We adjust the forms that we write to the medium itself, taking into account the particular constraints and affordances that the medium offers us. It also speaks to the point of the importance of textualization that began here with cuneiform writing, that made it possible for people to come back to utterances or concepts that were laid out in clay, returned to, studied, practiced, not only at the time when they were with the scribe, but they could study this on their own and practice. So that again is something that we see today. One of the big affordances of technology is that you can study independently of a master. Okay, again, this is not working as usual. Okay, now moving up to wax tablets, which were the precursor to the codex. Again, the idea would be that you would compose in wax. These were like word processors, in that then after you had written and used the text, maybe for a speech, you would then wipe the wax and be able to use that for additional text. Or you could edit. You could rub out a word and then reinscribe another word in its place. Quintilian has got a great anecdote about this. One of his disciples was always speaking in too long discourse. His speeches were too long. And Quintilian talks about how they gave him, and the problem was he was using a very wide tablet. So they gave him a narrow tablet, and they said the cure was instantaneous. From then on, he was able to get to the point because of this material limitation in developing his speeches. Moving on, and then from this physical design of having the wax tablets tied together, the codex manuscript followed from this design with bound material that would fold and expose both sides. Another material dimension is when it comes to scripts. The Devanagari script used for Sanskrit, Hindi, other languages was developed for use on bark and on wood. And you see that there's this horizontal line that tops each of the signs. Well, in coastal areas in southern India, they tried using the Devanagari script, but because the material that they used was palm leaves, because that's what's widely available, they found that this matra line that goes across here was splitting the palm leaf. So they developed curvilinear script that would not split the palm leaf. And so this Malayalam script here, Burmese script, you can see how curved they are. The curvature was due to the material on which this was written, on palm leaves, so that there would be no splitting of the medium. Okay, so over time, all of these different media have been used in different ways for language learning. And today, these are all synthesized in the computer. And that this is changing the relationship between teachers and learners in new ways, just as all media have. So, for example, in the case of the book, prior to the book and to the more exactly the mass production of books, the student would study in the presence of the teacher. The teacher was the font of knowledge. And when books became mass produced, then the teacher was more the interpreter of the book, but the book contained the knowledge to be learned. And now, with computers, as most of you probably know, the teacher is just there to be fact-checked on the iPhone as he or she talks. And the students, the real thing is not what the teacher has to say, but what's on the internet. And so there is this, again, change in the relationship between students and teachers through different media. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the importance of medium and mediation, and this being one of the really important things that we need to focus on, I think, when we're teaching language, because language is yet another form of mediation. And as you change from using one language to the next, you are changing the very ways in which you frame and think about things in the world, as well as abstractions, notions, and so forth. And that each medium that we use is going to transform the ways in which we think about and express ideas. So what I'd like to do is, over the next number of slides, think about the role of mediation. So what we've been talking about is how technologies make it possible for us to develop texts. And this process of textualization, I think, is fundamental to education, especially when you think that most of what we learn is not through direct experience through the senses, but through what we experience through language. Whether it is written language or spoken language, knowledge has been formulated, textualized, and then is disseminated, and that much of our learning happens through this highly mediated form. But students are not necessarily thinking about how mediated this is. And it's particularly important when you think about how we learn through visual means such as film, audio means such as radio, textual means such as books, articles, and so forth. And so when I talk about literacies, I'm going to be talking about the know-how that's involved in the use of technologies, the production and the interpretation of texts, and how the interface between technologies and texts operate. I'm abbreviating here because we're losing time, so I'm hoping I'm not skipping too much over the details here. Let's take a look at music, for example, the visualization of music. So I'd like to play a little section here of a program called the Music Animation Machine. And I think the speakers are hooked up. So let's see. Here we have something coming up here with low notes. Okay. So then we can compare that with the notation used in player pianos with the same piece, but now intended for a machine, and how similar it looks in certain ways, but used in a very different manner. And then looking at the same piece of music written out in music notation for a human performer. What kinds of information are represented? What kinds of information are left out? There are certain things about the first animation that are not represented in this. However, this gives us much more fine-grained detail about, for example, harmony. That initial representation didn't give us. So with each representation, we're both adding certain dimensions that we can manifest and we're also making decisions about what is not possible, what is going to remain hidden in that particular representation. Okay, another important thing to keep in mind is that whenever we're dealing with texts, we can't think of them autonomously. We always are interpreting them in terms of a particular context. So here's just a few items right here. So what is this? What do you see right here? 10, okay. If we were in a computer science class and we were talking about binary code, this would not be 10, but 2. Okay. How about this one? What does that say? 1/4, okay, so it could be a fraction, but that's not all it could be. 25%, okay. Still same notion of 1/4. Could it be anything else? January 4th, okay. Is that the only date that it could be? April 1st. Okay, it depends on what system you're operating in, and that's the key thing here. So what about this right here? Okay, Karen's already on the ball here. Okay, it could be coin, but it could be coin. But if it could be coin, what does that mean? Again, we have a choice. It could be the corner of the room, but it could be the sound that a duck makes as well, coin, coin. So, okay, there we go. So again, the systems multiply as do the meanings. Okay, and then this last one, this is clearly English, but what's the word? Okay, we don't know how to pronounce it until we know what the context is, because it could be entrance, but it could be entrance, depending on the context of how it, so we don't even know how to pronounce the item. So all this to say that we can't be just looking at the text autonomously, but in their particular material context. So this is taken in Lyon at the École Normale Supérieure. And so what do we have here? Some graffiti that is drawing on well-established symbols. Is this something that could be uttered? Could this be vocalized? Not really. Would this have meaning if I wrote it on the chalkboard here at UVA? Probably not. It happens to be spray painted on the wall of the library of the ENS. And it's that physical positioning which gives it its value of the euro sign, the dollar sign, and the name of the school. So this is something that when you dislocate it, okay, here we're looking at it as a slide at UVA. It's been decontextualized and now used as an example. So it has yet another meaning overlain on top. Around the corner, we have La France, lol, written on the side of a house. Okay, so again, we have a resituation of online lingo that is now spray painted on the side of a house and is, again, not something that is part of the spoken language, but is very much interpretable in its physical setting right here in Lyon. Again, very difficult to transport that text and put it on a wall in Charlottesville and have it be interpretable, at least not in the same way. Signs, when they were posted along the side of a road, they have certain meanings. In this setting right here, these signs don't have that same meaning. They're just signs because of their physical situation. Same thing here, where they've been now used for an artistic production, but they're certainly not telling you about the speed or watch out for bicycles or about pedestrians or motorcycles. It's been repurposed. Again, all kinds of street signs that have been cut up and made into flowers, recontextualized, not at all having the meanings that they originally had. Here we have a street sign. So what does this say? Okay, yeah, pedestrian crossing. Okay, so you have to read it from the bottom up. And why is that? Because when you're driving, this is the first thing that you come to. So as you move through space, this is the first item, then this is the second item. And we have abbreviation why? Because pedestrian's too long a word. So we want to make it, in order for it to be visible at a distance, we want to make it big. If we're going to make it big, it has to be short. So we'll just take the beginning. And then what happens here? We have abbreviation, but we also have the use of a symbol for crossing. So here we're, again, working in multiple systems, both orthographic and iconic, and spatially oriented for a particular assumption that one is moving through space towards this text. Now, what happens when we see the same thing on a sign? Well, it gets reversed. Now we read top down because it's no longer on a road. This is parallel to our plane of vision, or perpendicular, and so we're seeing both these items at once. So we revert to the normal thing. Same items, but in a different order because of the spatial orientation and through the assumption of how we're moving through space as we approach this. Same thing when you see writing. Why is this written backwards? Well, because you're supposed to be seeing it through your rear view mirror. If you see the ambulance on the street, it's not relevant. You know it's an ambulance. But in your rear view mirror, it's important to be able to see that. In parts of Asia, this is the passenger door. They will write taxi starting with the T at the beginning and ending with the I, and then it's mirrored on the driver door, with the idea being that as you move through space, the T is the first letter and then the I is at the end, so that you on both sides of the car, you start with the T and move towards the I, rather than having this disequilibrium of it written normally. But again, tied into these assumptions about cars moving through space and how language should be configured. Okay, so here's a tweet. Does anyone want to read this one? Okay, I'll read this one. It says, within the broader context of ensuring a quality education for every student, international education and foreign language study are vital to giving those students full access to the world around them. Secretary of Education Arne Duncan. So this was then, we see that this was retweeted from Actful. So it was originally posted on the Actful site. So these are, to go back to that original thing that I was talking about with literacy having to do with technologies and text, there's a certain know-how that has to do with technical things like this in terms of what RT means, what the ampersand means, and so forth, that we have to know how to cope with in order to interpret with this. Okay, and why is the language written like this? 140 character limit. You want to pack this information in so that it is interpretable. Now, its interpretability depends on your socialization into this kind of abbreviation. If Twitter were new today, this kind of writing would be very hard to decipher. But after a few months, a few years, this becomes like second nature. When I show this to my students, they just read it right off as if it were written in fully blown text. Okay, now I'd like to move to video conferencing, which is something that I've been working on for a number of years now, and Nuva has been participating in this from the French side. So this is a diagram of Ferdinand de Saussure's model of speech and communication, where you have speaker A conceiving of an idea, encoding this into language, and then B hearing this and uncoding or decoding this and having the same concept activated in the mind, which is a very problematic model, but I won't go into that right now. But what I'd like to focus on is how problematic it becomes when you introduce these computer screens in the process. Because what A is seeing is an image of B, what B sees is an image of A, and sometimes these images are not reflecting the reality behind the screen. So let's watch one excerpt of a Berkeley student together with a student from Lyon who is tutoring her.
J'ai beaucoup de rédaction et d'examen la semaine prochaine. Et, ouais. Et je suis un peu anxieuse pour les examens. Ouais.
Pourquoi tu n'es pas une élève studieuse?
Non, je suis studieuse, mais je me stresse. Oui.
Pourquoi? Parce que c'est ta dernière année?
Ah oui, oui, mais ce n'est pas une raison pour être stressée, c'est une raison pour être décontractée parce que c'est près de la fin.
Oui, mais bon.
Okay, so what do you notice about this interaction? Any reactions, things you notice? Liz, you had... It's delayed, okay. Okay, when you say paused, what gets paused? The image. And what happens, where does it pause? When he's looking up like this. So the student is talking like this, and his face is frozen looking up like this as she's talking to the screen. Also, when he moves, what's happening in the camera?
Not really, but it looks like you're getting closer to her and then further from her.
Right, and the webcam exaggerates the proximity. So his forehead gets huge as he moves in his chair. And he's on several occasions looking up. Sorry? And his mouth is not moving when his voice is going. So there's a lack of coordination between the sound and the screen. Now we're going to look at a view from inside the room. This is the same moment, but now we're seeing it from within the room.
C'est normal pour vous, c'est le matin. Oui. Tu vas bien? Oui. Tu as passé une bonne semaine?
Ah oui, bonne semaine.
Oui.
Mais oui.
Tu
J'ai
as...
beaucoup de rédaction et d'examen la semaine prochaine.
Oui.
Et je suis un peu anxieuse
Ah,
pour les examens.
pourquoi tu n'es pas une élève studieuse?
Non, je suis studieuse, mais je me stresse.
Pourquoi? Parce que c'est ta dernière année?
Ah oui, mais ce n'est pas une raison pour être stressé, c'est une raison pour être décontracté.
Okay.
Parce que c'est près de la fin.
So we learn a couple of things from this. In the original thing, you saw that his eyes were moving around a lot, okay? So what do we learn from this in terms of where his gaze is directed? we see that he has all these papers around now. This is his lesson plan that he's using, and also where he's noting her errors. And he is also the focal student who will be the subject of a discussion by his peers following this. And so he is the one who has designed the lesson. He's the one who will be scrutinized in this seminar meeting afterwards. So he's very nervous about how he's handling the lesson. So he's paying close attention to all his papers, making sure he's got this in his mind. Now, from the student's point of view, she felt that he was very nervous and not focusing on her because his eyes were going all over. And when she drew her image, because we asked students to represent their experience in some sort of visual sense, she drew eyes going everywhere in her visual representation. And so part of the thing is that she didn't know, first of all, what his physical situation was with all these papers laid out. She just sees his eyes darting all over the place. She didn't know that Caroline, who was the research assistant, was in the room with him, and that he was looking up at her. And when that camera froze, it was because he was just glancing up for a moment at her, but the camera happened to freeze, or it wasn't the camera, but it was the transmission lost. It wasn't transmitting, and so his gaze froze there. It was just momentary, but for the student, he was looking away for about 15 seconds, which is a long time in the interaction. So all of these things combined give us the idea that the webcam is picking up one aspect of what is happening, and you develop a representation of the other through what you see. But that may not jive totally with what the real situation is. And yet again, this is another camera view, so this is not the total picture as well. Here is another situation where this is an in-room camera of these two French tutors. This is what they see on their laptop screen. I'll just narrate this very briefly. What happens is that they're talking with these students. They ask, did you watch that video that we talked about last time? And the students say, whoops, no. So they bring up the video on their screen, and they start watching it on their screen. When they watch that video, it covers their screen. It covers up the Skype window. They're looking at the screen, so it looks to their French tutors like they're looking at them. They're looking in the same place they always look. But then at the same time, I'm at another station and I say, we're having a technical problem, we're going to have to disconnect. My voice gets transferred through their microphone to them. They say, huh? Why should we disconnect? We're not having any problems, are we? And they say, hey, you guys, we're not having any problems, are we? They don't answer because they're watching the video. And then they say, uh-oh, we've got a problem here. Let's call in the assistant. So she comes in. All of this because they don't know what the other is doing, although it looks like they're in visual and audio contact. So we'll see how this plays out. Again, this is their screen in Lyon. They're watching it right now. Okay, so you get the idea. Okay, so these are the kinds of issues that come up and that to the participants are often very disconcerting because they don't understand necessarily what might be happening on the other side. They figure as long as the students are looking at us like they usually do, they see us. As long as we're speaking, they must hear us. But this is not always the case. Okay, so the idea here is that also when once language is textualized, it can be reframed, reconfigured, resituated, and give rise to new meanings. And you know, one way of getting this across to students is when you think about transcribing speech. There are many, many different ways in which speech can be transcribed. And each way will reveal something interesting about the discourse, but it will also hide other things. And so depending on how you lay out the language on a sheet of paper or in some multidimensional form, it will influence the interpretation that you take because it's one perspective on that. So in a sense, you would need to have multiple representations of speech in visual form in order to get what might be taken as the full meaning in interaction. I'd like to, one of the great things about doing video conferencing I've found is that the students have a chance to revisit these online interactions. Because they're recorded, they can go back and try and understand things that they didn't understand at the moment that they were communicating with their partners. And oftentimes they will have written exchanges or online exchanges with their partners about this after the fact. And sometimes the tutors will send them back. So let's just play what one student talks about here.
There's a lot less pressure. Because when you're actually like having a conversation with her, it's like...
Okay, here's where it starts.
It's kind of like rereading a book that you've already read in terms of like the familiarity. Like you kind of know what's coming up next, so the next time you catch more stuff. So I felt like I had a better clarity of like what exactly happened in the conversation. I have more self-awareness in terms of like what I said. I'll be like, oh, okay, like I know what I was trying to say at that point in time. I can hear now what I did say, but I think that, you know, I think now that I could have said it better this way. So it's just, it's sort of similar to like going back and like editing an essay or anything like that. You know, you're sort of reappraising your own work.
Okay.
It's nice to...
Oops. This is another interface that was developed in Lyon called Visu that gave each participant a separate window. And again, this is where the medium has a direct impact on the social configuration in that the two Berkeley students they couldn't sit side by side like they did with Skype because what happened was their voices entered the headphones of the other, went to France, and then came back through the headphones, and you had this terrible echo that was not suppressible and made listening impossible. So we had to actually separate the Berkeley partners into separate labs. They appear on the screen as if they were sitting, you know, right in the same place, but they're actually in completely different rooms. And they had, when we interviewed them afterwards, they had really no sense of being partners because they were always separate from one another. The people who were actually together in this room were people who were never talking with one another. So the idiosyncrasies of the medium had a direct effect on the social configuration in the class. But one of the good features of this particular interface was this timeline, which allowed all parties to put in markers when there were interesting things that they wanted to come back to. So you could just click here and it would leave a trace, allowing you to then rewind the interaction to that particular place and then discuss it together. And what the French students were doing was making summaries of things for the students to pay attention to, and so they would sometimes refer to particular points along the timeline as examples that the students could come back to. So the students found this very useful, but again, it had some negative consequences in terms of the configuration in the room. I also want to come, in terms of the slide before, when we talked about the learning from viewing these things, also it was a question of learning in terms of their physical behavior. So for example, this student, he had his partner sitting right here, and when he watched the video, the recording, he found that often he would gesture with his hands a lot, and he found that as he moved his right hand, he was covering up his partner's face most of the time. And so he said, I made a concerted effort to gesture just with my left hand, and it was off screen, but that was okay because I like to gesture, but I didn't want to cover up my partner's face. So we saw him, gesturing, but not doing it this way because he had gotten that visual feedback of what it looked like from the partner. Also, sometimes when we were using Skype, there would be that little window where you see yourself, like in a corner here. And sometimes when either students or the French tutors would see the replays, they would see that a lot of their gestures were actually hidden behind this monitor on the other side. And so they would make a point of moving their gestures at different locations. So again, in response to the idiosyncrasies of the medium, people not only speak differently sometimes, but also behave differently. So this is just some examples of, I talked earlier about the visual representations that the students did, and we have lots and lots and lots of these. Dave Malinowski, who was a student at Berkeley, did a nice article in Pedagogies about this, these visual representations. But here, this student has got this line right here, which is kind of like the dividing line, the screen, which separates all the American images from all of the French images, and the two have their palms together. It's not super clear in this particular on this particular screen. Here is a student that this may not be super clear to you either, but her idea was that this was illustrating a transition for her. So on the left-hand side, you have very childlike, simple images of boats and trees. And then as you move to the right through time, you get much more fine-grained detail, much more elaborate images of boats and the trees. And she saw this as the progress that she had made in her French through this experience, that she saw things in much sharper relief through her experience working with the French tutors. Here's another one that saw the eyes of the tutors, but also the eyes of the people who were not only the teacher, but we had research assistants in the room, and she felt like she was being looked at from all sides, and especially the webcam. And then at the lid, there is Japanese, Chinese, and French. And then she says, encore une fois, s'il te plaît, and pourrais-tu parler plus lentement? And then she has Chinese and Japanese, and the idea was that through her brain, as messages came out, she mixed up these languages, and she said, oh, the only expression that comes to mind is in Japanese right now. And then she would have to think back in terms of what that would be in French. And so she felt like there was this filter of many languages that she had to get her brain to go through. I'd like to talk a little bit about working across media, and I know that some of you are working on film. So this is an example of students creating their own films to think about how representation in visual language, in other words, written text, differs from meaning representation in a filmic context. And so what they did was they took Pushkin's story, The Queen of Spades, and they made a film version of it. This was for a Russian conversation class as sort of a semester project that they did. And so their key project was to think about, in this story, Pushkin creates lots of ambiguity about what is real, what is fantastic, and the problem they had to face was how to recreate this ambiguity that is felt in the text, but in a filmic context. So we're going to see just a couple of examples of scenes that were taken from this. So here we have one scene where the protagonist, Herman, has been to the old lady. He wanted to scare her into giving him secret information that would allow him to win at this game of faro. So he shows up late at night in her room with a gun, and the problem is that she does get scared. She gets scared to death. So she dies. He is in a terrible state. So here we have Herman was extremely distressed the whole day, dining at a secluded tavern. He drank too much, which was not his wont, in the hope of calming his inner agitation. But the wine only further inflamed his imagination. Returning home, he threw himself on his bed fully clothed and fell into a deep sleep. It was night when he woke up. The moon was shining into his room. Just then, somebody looked in from the street through the window and immediately went away. A minute later, he could hear the door of the anteroom open. His orderly, thought Herman, was returning from a nocturnal outing, drunk as usual. But he heard unfamiliar steps. Somebody was softly shuffling along in slippers. The door opened, and a woman in a white dress came in. Herman took this for his old nurse and wondered what could have brought her here at this time of night. But the woman in white glided across the room and suddenly appeared right before him. Herman recognized the countess in her. Okay, so how do you deal with just then somebody looked in from the street through the window and immediately went away? What is the point of view that is being taken here? Glided across the room. Is this someone who's really there, or is it in his imagination? He's been drinking all night. Is this an hallucination? Well, these were the kinds of things that the students had to discuss and then figure out how they were going to film. So we'll watch how they did this particular scene. So the camera shows the bottle and Herman, and now well, this doesn't show very well with the light, but now we're out on the street and it's blurry, and we look in through the window at Herman, who's asleep.
Я пришла к тебе против своей воли, но мне велено исполнить твою просьбу. Тройка, семерка и туз выиграют тебе сразу. Но с тем, чтобы ты в сутки более одной карты не ставил, и чтоб во всю жизнь уже после не играл. Прощаю тебе мою смерть с тем, чтоб ты женился на моей воспитаннице, Елизавете Ивановне.
Okay, so that's how they handled that particular scene, and then we see how this plays out the next day when now he has this information from the Countess. So now he's going to try his luck at Faro, now that he knows how to win the game. The ace has won, said Herman as he turned his card face up. Your lady has been murdered, said Czekalinsky affably. Herman shuddered. Indeed, instead of an ace, the queen of spades lay before him. He could not fathom how he possibly could have pulled the wrong card. Suddenly it seemed to him that the queen of spades had screwed up her face and grinned. An extraordinary likeness struck him. The old woman, he cried out in terror. So here is how they filmed this scene.
Туз! Выиграл!
Dama ваша убийца.
Старуха!
Слово аплодировал.
Тройка, семерка, туз. Тройка, семерка, дама. Тройка, семерка, туз. Тройка, семерка, дама. Тройка, семерка, туз. Тройка, семерка, дама.
Okay, so Hermann goes off to a mental institution where he spends the rest of his days at that point. Okay, but what was great for the students was when we talked to them afterwards, they talked about the best part being these discussions about how they would translate or transduce what they had seen in the text in a filmic representation and what got left behind, what they couldn't do, and what compromises they had to make. So again, thinking about as you move across media, thinking about not only what new possibilities you have, but also what you have to leave behind as not being as expressible or as well expressible. Okay, so just to sort of sum this up, the key metaphor I use for this is design, and that design is related to material resources. We've seen a lot of examples of that. Also social resources, conventions, and that these social resources and material resources are also combined with individual creativity, individual needs, individual situations, and that all of these interact with one another. So it's not that one element is crucial here. So if we think back to this particular thing, we have the material resource of the wall at the ENS, which is crucial to the meaning of this, but we also have these social conventions of $, euro sign, and then the N for normal in the middle. And it's the individual who has spray painted this idea, who had this idea that is inventing or innovating given these material and social resources at his or her disposal. Okay, so in terms of implications of all of this, I think the first point would be that as we think about teaching, the medium really is something that we want to pay attention to, because the medium is going to influence how we use language, how we communicate, the kinds of strategies that we used. And so that when we're thinking about measuring learners' competence, we also want to be thinking about in what contexts, with what media, we are measuring their competence, and making sure that we're sampling their competence in a wide variety of forms and media, and not just, for example, their spoken competence in a face-to-face interview or their written competence in a table essay, but thinking more broadly in a variety of physical contexts, social contexts, and so forth. Second point, that we want to be thinking about the importance of textualization and recontextualization. And I think these are really at the heart of what technology has to offer. The ability to fix language use in time and in space, and to also fix contexts. So for example, when we saw the video conferencing interactions, to be able to record those and then be able to go back and observe, listen to not only the language, but also the physical context, the gestures that were happening, the facial expressions, the other forms of body language. And then thinking about ways that we can reframe or recontextualize or remediate things. So for example, when the students were taking a written text and thinking about how that could be remediated in a film, or thinking about how a song could be remediated in poetry, or remediated in a political speech, or remediated in a theater context. All of this, I think, is very important that we focus on. So essentially, I think that focusing on mediation takes us beyond just thinking in terms of language proficiency or communicative competence, and leads us to think more about symbolic competence, or what I'm thinking about calling semiotic agility, or critical semiotic awareness. I'm tossing around a number of terms, but the idea being that there's a reflectiveness about language use in context, in material situations, that goes beyond just knowing words, structures, speech patterns, written genres, but an awareness that allows students to be thinking critically about form, context relations, so that they can be prepared for new generations of media as well, and not just the ones that we're used to right now. I guess the point that I would like to make is that we find ourselves right now at, I think, a really interesting time talking about technology and language teaching, and that we should be thinking not just in terms of the efficiency, that we can teach language with lots of authentic materials from around the world, and making things efficient, or more motivating, or more inclusive. It does all those things, or it can, but that we also should be thinking about studying the very ways that technology mediates language use in communicative context, in expressive contexts, so that we're not just thinking about language, but also mediation more broadly. And so what I talk about here in terms of a relational pedagogy is drawing students' attention to the kinds of relationships between material, social, and individual resources that will allow them to analyze whatever it is, a YouTube video, a book, a poem, a song, a political speech, face-to-face conversation, in new ways, thinking in terms of not just the language, but how the language is relating to the broader context. And then thinking about how meanings are made, framed, and reframed as they're moved from one context to another. I mean, it used to be that we thought of teaching language to prepare students to go abroad, that that's where they would really use their language. Nowadays, with globalization and the internet, we're all using multiple languages, often many times a day, sitting at home on the internet, and much of our communication is mediated by the internet. So when we think about preparing our students, we need to be thinking about their linguistic preparation, their cultural preparation, yes, but we also have to be thinking about the means by which they are communicating with others. And so I think it's important that we think about the mediational properties of different computer or digital resources that they are using, all with the idea that in order to be not only proficient, but able to critique and perhaps shape future technologies, they will need these kinds of perspectives and skills as they go through their careers. So that's sort of the pitch that I'm thinking of making in this book, that we should be thinking of technology in this broad sense, not just in terms of as just a tool, but also as a mediator, and that it's focusing on these mediational properties that's really central in getting students maximally prepared for the kinds of experiences they'll have. So any thoughts that you might have on that idea would be very welcome. And so I thank you for your attention, and be happy to answer any questions if you have any.